We are all familiar with the hero's journey, the storytelling structure commonly used in screenwriting. However, the concept of the monomyth was never intended as such by its author, Joseph Campbell. In fact, in order to create such methodology out of his work, considerable parts of it were cut out. Specifically the weird and interesting parts, which are going to be essential for our analysis, which is why I'll briefly go over them before starting. The cosmogonic cycle is a term used to describe the pattern of creation myths. At the beginning of time there was nothing, the absolute darkness of chaos, out of which the original demiurge and his children formed the world we live in. There is a lot more to it, but what's important to us is what happens after. The normal world, called the waking day by Campbell, becomes gradually separated from the original chaos, the deep sleep, leading to disharmony. The cycle part comes in form of a repeating appearance of a hero who ventures beyond the borders of his ordinary world and into the unknown otherworld of primordial chaos. By returning from this chaos to his home, he brings the forgotten ancient aspect of the deep sleep with him, thus regenerating the said world, which then starts to gradually move away from the deep sleep again, leading to the appearance of yet another hero, and so on the cosmogonic cycle goes. What's interesting is that it's not entirely made up. Our ancestors, according to researchers like Freidenberg and Veselovsky, had a very different perception of reality to that of our own. Upon looking at such a landscape, we see a rock, a tree, and a sky. But an ancient man would not perceive it like that. He would just see one unified space. Trees, earth, sky, and even his tribesmen are not individualized objects, but parts of the one whole cosmos, embodied in the image of a tribe's totem. Such totemic worldview would gradually become more and more complex, eventually leading to our current perception of reality through names and concepts. This evolution of consciousness is what the creation myth symbolizes. This is a heavily cut down version of the idea, but for our analysis it's more than enough. Now, the reason why the structure of the monomyth is so effective, why it resonates so well with us, and why like 90% of myths coincide with it, is because it is rooted in our psychology. The opposites of the deep sleep and the wakeful day are correlated to the unconscious and the conscious, which Campbell bases on the works of Jung and Freud. Jung believed that the totemic worldview left a mark in the collective unconsciousness, forming an array of archetypes, psychological symbols, according to the mythological imagery. According to Jung, myth and ritual were the instruments of psychotherapy of the ancient man. Jung's methodology attempted to unearth those symbolical archetypes and thus imitate ritual to cure patients of neurosis through the assimilation of said archetypes. Unconscious becomes, in that line of thinking, the space of myth, through which the deep sleep continues to exist in modern human alongside the conscious wakefulness. Before I proceed, I should mention that what Campbell means by the word spirituality is not exactly what I personally denote as such. I maintain a rather Platonic vision of spirituality as an aspiration to the ideal, be it through art, science, philosophy, or other means, which develops the capacity of an individual to think and feel. To Campbell, spirituality is the inner peace of a person, the feeling of harmony between oneself and the universe that is achieved through ritual and myth. So, Odysseus and Conan are deeply spiritual people, Faust and Hamlet are not. Unlike Jung, Campbell believes that myth represents more than mere psychotherapy. He perceives the deep sleep and the wakeful day as the two fundamental sides of the human condition, between which the existence of both the individual, through hero's journey, and the society as a whole, through cosmogonic cycle, takes place. while Freidenberg considers the totemic worldview to be no more than an artifact of our species' past, and Jung sees the unconscious and conscious as the two inseparable parts of the one whole psyche, Campbell considers those two to be fundamentally different psychological and symbolical spaces, the interaction between which occurs through ritual and myth. The ritual is a tool for the interaction between the conscious and the unconscious. Myth is not just an echo of an ancient's attempt at understanding the world through a limited perception of a totem, just as it is not merely a random array of archetypes we had derived from them, and which we now have to carry in our collective unconsciousness. Myth is a manual, a guide to the death of ego and spiritual metamorphosis. Myth's understood function is to serve as a powerful picture language for the communication of traditional wisdom. The culture patterns have been shaped to them, the youth have been educated, and the aged rendered wise through the study, experience, and understanding of their effective initiatory forms, for they actually touch and bring into play the vital energies of the whole human psyche. The myth is a perfectly constructed tool which allows the mystic to find the road beyond the conscious and into the deep sleep without form and logic. Now you see what I mean by weird, huh? Well, strap yourselves in, because this is just the beginning. Arrakis and Imperium are the two principal spaces of Dune, corresponding to the unconscious and the conscious. They are characterized by the mythological and futuristic elements, respectively. To correctly understand the mythological aspects of Arrakis, the deep sleep, we must first examine the futuristic elements of Imperium, the wakeful day. The Imperium functions under the principles of rationalism and individualism. In this world, operating on logic and reason survives the strongest. The strength of an individual is determined by his financial and cultural capital, wealth, power, and influence. The political hierarchy of such individuals forms the pyramid structure of power. Advancement in this hierarchy is done via intrigue, blackmail, and corruption. Imperium is a hyperbolic depiction of a capitalistic society with the characteristic class difference. The wealthiest House Harkonnen is capable of paying off the massive guild fees, guild being the equivalent of a mega corporation, only acquiring the needed sum after years of saving up for it. Compared to that, the Fremen, who are placed so low in the hierarchy they are below slaves, being so deprived as to having to recycle the water of their dead for survival. Logic is elevated to a cult in this space with the Order of Mentats, which become a symbol of the rational world of Dune.
I've always prided myself on seeing things the way they truly are. That's the curse of being a Mentat. You can't stop analyzing your data.
The technological advancement in the world of Dune has reached such a level purely because technology is a valuable instrument of power. By maintaining monopoly on interstellar travel, the Guild stands at the top of this hierarchy. The waterless wasteland of Arrakis, despite the available technology, remains unchanged due to the lack of any political or economic benefits of its terraforming for any figure who would have the required resources for such an enterprise, thus condemning the people of Arrakis for a life of not just starvation, dehydration. The critique of capitalism is realized through the display of the oppressed states of the lower classes as well as corruption of the upper ones. The very mechanism of advancement along this hierarchy is conducive for the most egotistical of people to get the greatest of power. which in Dune is illustrated via the triumph of the corrupt Harkonnens over the moral Atreides. Arrakis is a space juxtaposed to Imperium as operating upon the principles of spirituality and mythological symbolism. Modern rules and methods do not work in this world. The energy shield providing safety in the ordinary world becomes dangerous in the other.
Shields are dangerous in the desert. A body-sized shield will call every worm for hundreds of meters around. It appears to drive them into a killing frenzy.
While Imperium provides relaxation and comfort through laws and technology, any momentary weakness in the other world leads to death. Arrakis corresponds to the mythological archetype of the world's navel.
And that day dawned when Arrakis lay at the hub of the universe with the wheel poised to spin.
The worms with that of a dragon, spice with mana. The consumption of spice, metaphor of gaining wisdom, changes the eye color to that of pure blue. World's navel is so full of spice that even the air is filled with it, while within the Imperium, spice is a luxury. Worms hold the title Maker in the language of Fremen, since it is them who produce spice. Without the challenges of dragons, there is no wisdom gained from their overcoming. Fremen, living on Arrakis, aspire to the described by Freidenberg totemic worldview. Their ideal of existence is that of a single organism. When someone is born or dies, every tribesman experiences joy or sadness, the water of each belonging to the tribe. Their lives revolve around rituals of initiation and myth. The luxury of Imperium, spice, is a part of their everyday diet. Conversely, simple water is sacred to them. The hierarchy formed within the tribe is determined by the strength of spirit, a human being's inner, not external, as an Imperium, value. At the top of this hierarchy is a shaman, the Reverend Mother, who has reached enlightenment through the ritualistic consumption of the water of life. A consciousness-expanding drug symbolically uniting within itself both the material, water, and the spiritual, maker, sides of human condition. Inner world harmony, represented through still suits that recycle the bodily fluids into drinkable water, is just as vital necessity in the other world of Arrakis as the capital is in the ordinary world of Imperium. The principle of the monomythic hero's journey, henceforth I'll just call it journey for short, is that only by going outside of normality and going through the initiation of a different mode of being can a person reach a harmonious existence, balancing the material and spiritual aspects of human condition. Upon finishing her journey, Jessica has acquired wisdom that allowed her to give the world with a child prodigy, Alia.
I brought you into this universe and exposed your awareness to all its varieties without any defenses.
While Leto, who failed the journey in my reading, performs the role of a father with mixed results. Leto shows weakness before his son, planting doubt and fear into his heart.
Paul swallowed in a dry throat. His father's words carried futility, a sense of fatalism that left the boy with an empty feeling in his chest.
By displaying weakness, desiring emotional support from his underage son at the time right before his initiation, Leto works against his cosmogonic role of a father.
The Duke turned, faced his son, revealing dark circles beneath hard eyes, a cynical twist of mouth. I should wed your mother, make her my duchess. Yet, my unwedded state gives some houses hope they may yet ally with me through their marriageable daughters.
That is a very significant difference between the book and pretty much every adaptation of Dune. In the novel, Leto is distinctly a broken man.
Paul stared at his father's back, seeing the fatigue in the angle of the neck, in the line of the shoulders, in the slow movements.
His influence on Paul is poisonous.
There is probably no more terrible instant of enlightenment than the one in which you discover your father is a man with human flesh.
An important thing to note is that Imperium and Arrakis are not synonymous with ordinary and other worlds of the Monomyth. Sure, for Paul, as an Imperium citizen, Arrakis is indeed the other world. However, for the Fremen, the other would be the Imperium. The very act of consciousness expanding journey is what's important here, not where to or from. Now, a very important thing I need to point out is that it's not just Paul and Jessica that undergo the hero's journey, as people often believe. Every single character in Dune has a specific relationship with the Monomyth, and via the resulting system of characters, Dune forms a gradient of possible interrelations with the Monomyth. I will not bore you with a recap of each character's narrative while correlating them with the stages of the journey. If you are interested in that, I will provide the link to it in the description. What matters for our analysis is not the minutiae of whether the supernatural aid of Paul is the Reverend Mother, as I believe it to be, or Dr. Yue, as it is according to Palombo, but the very fact of each and every character's integral relation with the Monomyth. You see, a myth is supposed to have one hero and one tyrant. Dune, however, is a dynamic system. The standings change depending upon whose perspective we currently examine. Chani is an essential person in the life of Paul.
She glanced at Paul, saw that he was caught up in the mystery of the ritual and had eyes only for Chani.
While for his mother, Chani is merely a servant of the Reverend Mother, the latter playing a significant role in Jessica's journey.
Jessica ignored Chani's approach, focusing all her attention on the woman in the litter.
For different characters, same people hold different monomythic significance. Chani herself undergoes a journey, with Paul performing the god groom role, and in his journey she is a goddess bride. Those roles change not only depending on whose perspective we occupy, but also in what moment. Chani, who performed one role in the Fremen siege, performs another during Paul's initiation into the adult Fremen.
"You call me your desert spring," she said, "but this day I'm thy goad. I am the Sayadina who watches that the rites be obeyed."
Note that the journey is not necessarily synonymous with initiation into new stages of life. Fremen are incapable of leaving Arrakis, thus unable to undergo the proper journey, but they are successfully performing the initiatory rituals, most notably by mounting a worm. For Fremen like Stilgar or Alia, the journey would imply travel to the Imperium and back. The rationalistic world of capitalism is their other. The care with which Hara and Jessica protect Alia and her very status of a Reverend Mother's daughter illustrates that for Alia, Arrakis is a world of idyllic childhood, which it is for every Fremen child due to their treatment of them, while for Leto that very same world was hell. The reason why Paul, Jessica, Leto, Hawat and several others, by undergoing the journey, get initiated into the new stages of life is because their other world functions through those very rituals, while their ordinary world only requires them to increase their capital. Hawat is valuable to Imperium as a mentat, not as husband or an old man. Yue as a doctor and conspirator, but not as a widower. A person might refuse the call to adventure, thus becoming what Campbell classifies as a tyrant usurper, ruling over the metaphoric kingdom of death. All that person does is breed turmoil and discord in the worlds either external for Fremen or internal for an Imperial. As an example, Yue plans to kill Harkonnen, taking his revenge for his wife. However, his plan is doomed from the start, since he refuses the call, as in refuses to accept the death of his wife. So when Yue, like a magical helper, gives Leto with a trinket, poisonous tooth, with which Leto was intended to overcome a trial and kill a tyrant, both Leto and Yue are destined for failure. Since the hero and the helper were both tyrants themselves, their trinket lacks the necessary magic power. Whatever house he builds, it will be a house of death. And so the ritualistic overthrowing of a tyrant Harkonnen was from the start fruitless. Interesting to note that according to the logic of myth, by living in inequity, Yue feels himself as if poisoned, second-guessing every word, walking as if on a razor's edge.
I'm sorry. I am unable to talk about it.
He opened his eyes, giving himself up to the internal awareness of grief. That, at least, was truth.
I came willingly.
And that, too, was true.
But this whole planet's a Harkonnen trap. You must know that.
It will take more than a trap to catch the Duke Leto.
And that, too, was true.
As Plato says in the Republic, therefore the just is happy and the unjust is a wretched person. It's a subtle bit of writing that shows his psychological state better than a plain description. The tyrant and the hero are not just binary states, for there is a whole gradient of states in between. The further the person gets along the journey prior to his failure, the less damaging is his tyrannical status. Leto has failed the journey by remaining unmarried to the woman with whom he lives and has children from.
The Duke is really two men. One of them I love very much. He's charming, witty, considerate, tender, everything a woman could desire. But the other man is cold, callous, demanding, selfish, as harsh and cruel as a winter wind. That's the man shaped by the father.
Her face contorted.
If only that old man had died when my Duke was born.
The schism between the hero and tyrant, as if Leto stands at the edge between life and death, Jessica attributes to the influence of his father, although it's incorrect. Leto himself is guilty for not walking the journey to its completion. By succumbing to Jessica's advice to remain unmarried for political gain, Leto has failed the stage of woman as a temptress, and thus hasn't even reached the stage of atonement with the father. The fact of Leto still being under such influence from his dead father, he couldn't dare to hang his portrait anywhere but in the dining room, for instance, speaks of a psychological complex. Only after the hardest of trials the ogre father turns into the loving father god, and Leto hasn't had the chance to pass that trial. The father has forever remained an ogre for Leto, preventing him from becoming a truly good husband and father. That wariness which he exhibits as he speaks to his son would not be there had Leto been capable of atoning with his own father. At the same time, Leto stands spiritually higher than the Emperor Shaddam IV, who has failed the journey at an earlier stage than Leto, the meeting with the goddess. Jessica has gifted Leto with a son, while the Emperor's wife left him without an heir. Being Bene Gesserit, they can control the sex of an embryo. Jessica has gone against her orders out of love, which Shaddam couldn't generate in his wife. But the Emperor stands higher than the smuggler Staban Tuek, who stopped at the Road of Trials. And Tuek is higher up than Yue or Harkonnen, who refused the call altogether. However, no matter how far the person goes down the path before stopping, he does still become a tyrant. When Yue betrays Leto, the atrophied spiritual side of his potential heroism does warn him of danger.
He started to stand up. A sixth sense warned him. He flashed a hand toward the shield switch, too late. A numbing shock slammed his arm aside.
However, it is not strong enough to help him overcome the challenge that both Jessica and Paul has passed. Paul has survived the killer drone in his room, and Jessica has passed the trial of Shadowed Mapes, intent on killing Jessica had she not been prepared by Bene Gesserit. The future hero feels the pull of the unknown, which Campbell describes as the shift in the center of his spiritual gravity. Thus Paul is fascinated by Arrakis, but Leto experiences mixed feelings. The hero in him does appreciate the beauty of Arrakis.
He had never imagined anything here could be as beautiful as that shattered red horizon and the purple and ochre cliffs.
The tyrant in him, however, is appalled.
The longing for Caladan was a sudden pain in his breast. He felt that it did not come from within himself, but that it reached out to him from Caladan. He could not bring himself to call this dry wasteland of Arrakis his home, and he doubted he ever would.
The longer the person drags out the acceptance of the call, the greater challenges he will have to face once he does. The same, however, extends to the potential wisdom he might gain after their overcoming. The Reverend Mother has to consciously refuse the call for as long as she can, so that when she accepts it, her journey would be most difficult. However, if she completes it, her wisdom would be absolute. The Reverend Mother must combine the seductive wiles of a courtesan, the id, with the untouchable majesty of a virgin goddess, the superego, holding these attributes in tension so long as the powers of her use endure. For when use and beauty have gone, she will find that the place between, once occupied by tension, has become a wellspring of cunning and resourcefulness. Freud classifies the described tension between the id and superego as a classic neurosis. However, by sublimating such a powerful case of neurosis, a higher state of spiritual being can be attained, according to Campbell. The result, of course, may be a disintegration of consciousness more or less complete. But on the other hand, if the personality is able to absorb and integrate the new forces, there will be experienced an almost superhuman degree of self-consciousness and masterful control. Leto, being a tyrant that repeatedly refutes the call of renewing his journey, holds a potential wisdom of a sage, which is symbolized by the enormous haul of spice, which represents wisdom, need I remind you, legally belonging to him. He, however, is not capable of overcoming the impossible trial cultivated by his prolonged refusal of the call. The worm of an equally enormous size, appropriately marked as his worm within the text, devours those deposits of spice. The completion of the journey leads an individual to the spiritual rebirth. However, just like tyranny, heroism has degrees of gradation. The further the hero traveled into the other world, the harder the roads he chose, the deeper is his metamorphosis.
There's a tale that a great motherlode of spice is to be found in the southern reaches. Casualties increase dramatically the farther you operate from shield wall bases.
Paul and Jessica has traveled the same path, however, it was Paul who made the most difficult of decisions. Flying into a deadly storm, for instance, as well as continued his journey past the point where Jessica has stopped. Paul, by traveling the hardest of all journeys, spiritually rises above her and, consequently, every other character of Dune. As has already been said, myth, according to Campbell, is a manual to the collective unconsciousness, leading the road to healthy psyche and even enlightenment. Ritual is an instrument for the activization of unconscious psychological processes. In Dune, there is a distinct line between the myth and its practical value. Myth is not valuable in and of itself, but for its influence on human psyche. You see, Arrakis is not a space of myth. It is not the projection of the collective unconsciousness, but an environment whose inhabitants live by the rituals and think through myth, aspiring to totemic worldview as an ideal mode of being. Due to the fantastical elements, symbology of myth, in particular dragons and mana, become one of the characteristics of that environment. However, and that is very important, it does not make the story of Dune a myth, nor Arrakis a space of myth. As an analogy, let's look at the novella Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which juxtaposes the spaces of Britain and Africa. The travel to the other world out of the ordinary world of England expands the consciousness of the protagonist in accordance to the structure of the monomyth. However, the tale itself cannot be considered a myth in that novella, just like Africa cannot be considered a space of myth. Dune presents a similar dynamic between worlds. However, because of a fantastic element within the realistic depiction of Arrakis, psychological elements of the narrative get explored with the greatest artistic impact. The image of a giant worm does represent the rooted in the unconscious insecurities, complexes, prejudices, fears, and mental issues that devour the man from the inside. On the other hand, their physical presence within the reality of the book actualizes the archetype of a dragon within the accidental passing of Jessica and Paul's journeys. It is similar to how a drunken citizen in Joyce's Ulysses performs the role of a mythological cyclops. Compared to Hobbit, Leopold Bloom is a believable character whose story gets integrated with the mythological symbolism. Bilbo, however, is himself a mythological character, and his story an imitation of myth. Paul, as all characters of Dune, I'd argue, are more akin to Bloom than Bilbo. If you want to see what the story of Dune would be if it were a pure imitation of myth, then look no further than the Manual of Muad'Dib. Mythological hero is invincible, and thus, upon the retelling in the Holy Book of Arrakis, Paul is invincible. However, initiation, inner harmony, and the heroic status, which are bulletproof armor for the characters of myth, do not ensure such invulnerability from the accidents of fate in the reality of Dune, which is something I'll elaborate more near the end. But for now, let's point out that Leto has died not so much because he was cosmogonically deemed to fail by becoming a tyrant, but because he started making frequent mistakes due to his neurosis.
"These Harkonnen creatures you eliminated," the Duke said. "Were they propertied? Confiscate their property. Take everything. Turn out their families. Strip them." "It's wrong," Paul thought. "This'll only make the others fight all the harder. They've nothing to gain by surrendering."
His mental illness has prevented him from being able to successfully adapt and effectively utilize the opportunities within a given moment. While the healthy Jessica and Paul could utilize those opportunities and survive, the worms of unconsciousness do not devour them from the inside like they do Leto. Thus, Jessica and Paul are capable of survival during the time of turmoil. This needs to be emphasized. The heroes of Dune are not mythological characters that symbolize psychological processes through their archetypes, but realistic characters that display the influence of archetypical symbolism on the human psyche, working as exaggerated through fantastical elements. Examples. As an example of this, let's examine the murder of James by Paul. The conscious awareness of a change in life is but a surface-level perception of it. The true realization comes from the actualization of mythological symbolism in a literal sense of the word. The wedding, the funeral, the graduation, all of those and much, much more are rituals which allow your unconsciousness to get that your life has changed, without which it would remain a mere observation of the consciousness, leading to all sorts of mental problems. Jessica considers the funeral of James as a mere formality, but Paul feels a deep resonance of this procedure with his inner world.
It will be more than that, Paul thought, and he felt a wrenching sensation within his awareness, as though he were trying to grasp something in motion and render it motionless.
The significance of the ritual, in which Paul has to take a musical instrument and the literal water from the body of a person he killed, saying that this person was his friend, is that this ritual prevents Paul's running away from the reality of what has occurred. Paul has experienced trauma by killing a man, trauma that will remain in his psyche whether or not he tries to avoid it. The ritual allows him to comprehend on a subconscious level that experience, to accept it as a reality changing from its influence. That which could become something that would plague Paul for his entire life becomes a stepping stone of his spiritual growth.
Paul felt the diminishment of his self as he advanced into the center of the circle. It was as though he lost a fragment of himself and sought it here.
What's also important is the collective nature of a ritual. Left to himself, Paul would have shut himself off from this traumatic experience, thus burying it into his unconsciousness. However, within the tribe, where people push him towards undergoing the ritual for the fear of being exiled, he had to undergo a painful yet deeply beneficial experience. In the modern world, people, out of pity, would have tried to save him from such a procedure, thus dooming him for a life of a neurotic. After the conclusion of a ritual, Paul is left not with PTSD, but with wisdom. Mythological symbolism is primordial. It is planted within the human psyche through thousands upon thousands of years of social evolution. If it's not actualized through an appropriate ritual, psyche tries to actualize it through dreams, which is something that is illustrated within the works of both Jung and Freud. That is what Campbell alludes to while arguing the value of myth as not merely the source of vivid fictional imagery, but as a tool for psychotherapy. It is no coincidence that Paul repeatedly recognizes aspects of Arrakis, the world's navel, aspects that correlate to archetypes.
And he paused, shaken by the remembered high-relief imagery of a prescient vision he had experienced on Caladan. He had seen this desert.
Initiation rituals and myths only point to that which everyone carries within. Paul recognizes the desert because his current path resonates with the archetypes of the collective unconsciousness. While Arrakis facilitates assimilation of archetypical symbolism through ritual, the Imperium promotes suppression of neurosis through comfort. Imperium is ahead of us by thousands of years of technological development. One of the prime drives of technological progress is the simplification of life and the increase of comfort. In Dune, as in life, this comfort softens people, allowing them to live with their problems instead of overcoming them. The mechanism that supports the beast body of Harkonnen is symbolic of his characteristic dependence upon the comfort granted with wealth and technology. Just like that mechanism supports his incapable of movement body, wealth and power support his diseased psyche, which is being devoured inside by the subconscious worms of neurosis. The House Harkonnen becomes characteristic of the Imperium space.
The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen raged down the corridor from his private apartments, past the private kitchen he stormed, past the library, past the small reception room, and into the servants' antechamber where the evening relaxation already had set in.
Note the attention to the private items, juxtaposed to Fremen for whom not just personal property, but personal space has dissolved into the unity of cosmos. Not private, not public property can exist in a world where all is a part of the undivided universe. Conversely, the private rooms of Imperium are made to provide an individual with a place to hide from the hardships of life. A man in harmony with his inner world has no need to hide within a private room. He is comfortable in any situation. The suffering experienced by the modern people of Dune like Leto, Yue and Harkonnen is due to the baggage of their subconscious worms tearing them from the inside. For the man who has mounted such worms, who made peace with his demons, such need to hide disappears. That is why Nephut, Harkonnen's servant, while occupying his private quarters, consumes a recreational drug.
The guard captain, Eochen Nephud, squatted on a divan across the chamber, the stupor of Semuta dullness in his flat face, the eerie wailing of Semuta music around him.
He escapes not from life, but from himself. This drug is juxtaposed with the Fremen's water of life, a drug that allows an individual to perceive and accept his inner self or die. When someone intervenes upon the private space of any citizen of Imperium, the latter becomes vulnerable. Nephut is dazed by the arrival of Harkonnen and has extreme difficulty maintaining his composure. Upon leaving his private palace of escapism, Nephut dons the mask of a servant, which is not something he can do easily.
Nephud stood, his face composed by the narcotic, but with an overlay of paleness that told of his fear. The Semuta music had stopped. "My Lord Baron," Nephud said. Only the drug kept the trembling out of his voice.
Harkonnen himself is the most prominent neurotic of the novel. Although he harbors the desire for the continuation of his dynasty due to his overinflated ego, he also fears his nephew.
"You do not consider Feyd-Rautha a danger to my person?"
His condition can be considered a self-denying state of a neurotic. He tries in his paranoia to control things beyond his grasp.
"Did I not command you to know precisely where the Nar-Baron was at all times? Did I not say to you that you were to know precisely what the Nar-Baron was saying at all times, and to whom?"
He overly depends on the protection of his ordinary world, on his status at the top of economical hierarchy. The ego of a man, controlled by his unrestrained id, becomes the breeding ground of regrets, guilts, lamentations. Harkonnen constantly ponders the loss of a valuable servant.
As he had done many times since that terrible day on Arrakis, he found himself regretting the loss of Paiter the Mentat.
This regret becoming one of his countless subconscious worms. Interestingly, despite his cunning, the Baron cannot comprehend the reason why the Mentat had to die.
There had been a man of delicate, devilish subtlety. It hadn't saved him, though. Again, the Baron shook his head. Fate was sometimes inscrutable.
A rational man, plagued by neurosis, loses the ability to conduct himself logically in life situations, becoming a slave of cosmic accident.
It would have worked too if Howard hadn't warned me. Well, let the lad believe I saw the plot on my own. What would he say if I told him Howard planned the trick with the Gladiator that cost him his slave master?
Not only Harkonnen, but the majority of characters in the Imperium space are neurotic. Leto we've already covered. Gurney and Yue suffer from traumas. From guilt the former and loss the latter. Hawat and Feyd refuse to grow old and grow up, respectively. The problem of Imperium is that by providing comfortable existence, it doesn't allow its inhabitants to suffer out the changes in their lives through the ritual or the hero's journey, thus condemning them for miserable existence with mental issues. all minor characters, the guests of Atreides in chapter 16, the cohorts of Emperor at the end, the servants of Harkonnen, and etc., also present an arrangement of neurotics who lose control over both themselves and the situation at the slightest trigger. This motif of dependence on technology and modernity leading to mental illness is not accidental, for in one of the expository dialogues, the backstory of Dune is revealed. In the past, people depended too much on technology, which led to a catastrophe.
Once men turned their thinking over to machines, in the hope that this would set them free. But that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them.
As a preventative measure from such a calamity, the orders of Mentats and, most importantly, Bene Gesserit were founded, whose job is to maintain knowledge and spiritual ways. They must train people who are not dependent upon technology for survival. The only inhabitants of Imperium who are not neurotic are the ones who underwent such initiation. Jessica, Paul, Lady Fenring, the Reverend Mother. However, according to Plato, you can pass the initiation once and be mentally sound for life. It is truly difficult to become a good person, but it is still possible, at least for a while. But having become such, to remain in the state that is to be, this is already impossible and not characteristic of a person. The characters who have passed initiation in the past, but refuse to do it again, become neurotic. Havat and Piter, after their initiation in the Order of Mentats, were healthy. However, during the course of a narrative, become mentally unsound. Gurney might be the best example of this. He agrees to work for a smuggler instead of going into the desert to Fremen, choosing Imperium's comfort instead of starting his journey after the fall of House Atreides, which is his call to adventure, thus becoming a neurotic and developing a guilt complex. This call is offered again later. Getting deep into the Arrakis desert, Gurney ventured out of bounds of the ordinary world, thus finally answering the call. In this other world, he encounters his supernatural aid, adult Paul. Essential detail of this narrative is that by refusing the call earlier, Gurney increased the difficulty of his eventual trials. Over the years since this first refusal, the misguided desire for revenge against Jessica, suspicion and hatred have been gnawing at his unconsciousness. Because of those subconscious worms, his conscious reasoning is clouded with the fog of emotion.
Gurney followed with Stilgar, stepping on ground that he did not even feel. The cavern with its yellow light of glow globes was forced out of his thoughts by rage. The she-witch alive, while those she betrayed are bones in lonesome graves.
Completely different is the situation with Paul, who, having also experienced loss and having a reason to desire revenge, not unlike Yue, almost immediately enters the other world upon receiving the call, in which he undergoes a path perfectly resonant with his unconscious archetypes. A path that serves as a therapeutic sublimation of what would otherwise become a neurosis.
He found that he no longer could hate the Bene Gesserit, or the Emperor, or even the Harkonnens. They were all caught up in the need of their race to renew its scattered inheritance, to cross and mingle and infuse their bloodlines in a great new pooling of genes.
Upon the completion of his journey, Paul becomes free from subconscious worms which plagues the inhabitants of Imperium. He doesn't feel hatred towards Harkonnen, who destroyed his house and killed his father. He isn't haunted by the ghost of his father like Leto, or guilt like Gurney. Unlike the Imperials, all inhabitants of Arrakis are not neurotic, with the exception of Jamis, who dies to Paul as a direct result of that. Despite the horrifying living conditions, deprived of not just the comfort of Imperium, but even of drinkable water, Fremen do not suffer from mental illnesses. Harsh living conditions tie into the ritualistic society and thus become therapeutic for those people that do survive them. Fremen initiate each other into each new stage of life, and every single major event is also accompanied with the corresponding ritual. Neurosis appearing as a result of a dissonance between the consciousness, which knows its age and place in life, and the unconsciousness, which doesn't feel any differences between the current and the past states of being, completely levels out with the totemic culture. Since this culture operates through the language of mythological symbolism, the very language which the unconscious understands. I need to point out that it is not so much the technology and comfort that are themselves responsible for the neurotic society of Imperium, but the throwing away of the rituals of mythological past. Bene Gesserit, who purposely keep those rituals to themselves along with the ruling neurotic tyrants, form an environment in which an individual is physically incapable of undergoing any meaningful ritualistic process. Fate, for example, in his unconscious desire to be initiated into adulthood, participates in literal hundreds of farcical gladiatorial battles, not a single one of which manages to trigger the actualization of archetypical symbolism, because they are all fake. Just compare the gladiatorial battle of Fate to the ritualistic duel of Paul. Paul underwent the initiatory trial in the other for him world. Fate was fighting for fun in the ordinary. Paul uses self-control over his impulses and emotions as well as his training. Fate uses tricks, poisons, and deception.
The slave would not be drugged. Instead, a keyword had been drummed into the man's unconscious to immobilize his muscles at a critical instant.
Paul has adapted to the ancient traditions, while Fate used the battle as a political statement.
And let them always be aware they cannot know for sure which of my hands carries the poison.
Paul has received a valuable spiritual experience from this murder. Fate merely appeased his pride.
When I'm barren, they'll remember this day, and won't be a one of them can escape fear of me because of this day.
Fremen were awed by Paul's shedding of tears for the murdered. The spectators were merely entertained by the show that Fate has provided. Both characters passed a formerly similar trial with a risk to their lives, but the context deems its value. That which enriched the inner world of Paul has further spoiled Fate's. Even the played-out, authentic rituals of the ancients in the context of Imperium space lose their sacredness, and with it a transforming psychological value.
You know, when you think what this lad could have been with some other upbringing, with the Atreides code to guide him, for example.
Fate is surrounded by comfort and wealth. The murders he commits, those traumatic experiences, are suppressed within his unconscious mind.
His dark hair was dressed in close ringlets that seemed incongruously gay above sullen eyes.
He is a child who hears the call of the journey, but lives in an environment where he cannot answer it. Within him there is a yearning for spiritual growth, which nevertheless has no ability to come to fruition.
Lady Fenring, noting the young man's poise and the sure flow of muscles beneath the tunic, thought, "Here's one who won't let himself go to fat."
His surroundings are what forms a neurotic out of him. And it's not just him. Nobody in the space of Imperium, that includes the servants and slaves of Harkonnens and other houses, would have an ability to sublimate their neurosis, even if the methods for their remedy had not been forgotten in this environment. Psychological complexes breed prejudices, which obstruct rational thinking, becoming weaknesses that can be exploited by others.
What do you despise? By this you are truly known.
Harkonnen uses the prejudice of Hawat to turn him to his side.
We will instead feed his suspicions against the Lady Jessica.
My lord, I don't...
The way to control and direct a Mentat Nefud is through his information. False information, false results.
Subconscious weakness becomes the breach through which the tyrant pours, through modern methods, comfort, safety, and luxury, corrosive lies into the heart of a would-be hero. Literally too, Baron poisons Hawat, keeping him alive with the antidote mixed in with his food. Blackmail is an effective modern method of conviction after all. Kynes, an actual initiated hero, thus someone with a healthy psyche, terrifies the Baron, while a neurotic Hawat becomes a mere toy in his hands. Harkonnen, although holding a high position in Imperium and maintaining a solid grasp on its politics, is completely inadequate in his perception of all relating to Arrakis, spirituality and strength of character. For instance, Sardaukars are rather unsophisticated when it comes to intrigue, so Baron falsely asserts that the Emperor uses them out of their political illiteracy, which renders them so easy to manipulate.
I've noticed a thing about our allies, Nefud. They're not very devious, politically. I do believe this is a deliberate thing. The Emperor wants it that way. Yes, I do believe it.
Not realizing the actual reason for Emperor choosing them, the inner strengths born out of trials and initiations of their home planet's culture. Baron believes that the fall of Atreides occurred because of his economic superiority over them, not Leto's inner turmoil.
We know how we overwhelmed the Atreides. Hawat knows too. We did it with wealth.
He literally cannot fathom that Fremen, standing infinitely below Sardaukar in the hierarchy of political power, could defeat said Sardaukar.
And when you consider the Fremen of...
The Fremen aren't worth considering.
They report that a Fremen band ambushed a Sardaukar force somewhere southeast of here and wiped it out.
Wiped out a Sardaukar force?
Yes, my lord.
Impossible. Fremen defeating Sardaukar?
He only perceives a politically economic aspect of human condition, while the spiritual remains completely invisible to him. He views a two-dimensional reality and sees only one axis. Harkonnen, thus remaining at the count zero along the spiritual axis, exists exclusively under the rationalistic capitalist rules. So an entire aspect of his opponent's tactics remains a complete mystery to him.
You think I don't know why the Emperor turned against House Atreides? This is not a realm open to your speculation, the Baron warned. Is it possible that even he doesn't know what motivated the Emperor in this? Howard asked himself.
The Emperor uses Sardaukar because of their spiritual power, and Fremen, as an even more spiritual tribe, become a menace to the Emperor. Leto and Hawat, who have, as has the Emperor, walked along a certain part of the hero's journey, are capable of perceiving Fremen as a threat. Such naivety of Harkonnen concerning Fremen becomes shocking to Hawat, who simply doesn't expect this of such a devious politician.
The Baron shook his head. You cannot mean the Fremen. I mean the Fremen. Ha! Then why warn Raban? There cannot be more than a handful of Fremen left after the Sardaukar pogrom and Raban's oppression. Hawat continued to stare at him silently. Not more than a handful, the Baron repeated. Raban killed 6,000 of them last year alone. Still, Hawat stared at him.
An entire dimension of human condition remains completely beyond his field of sight. Hawat has to translate spiritual ideas into material terms to get this threat across to Baron.
What if he has lost 30,000? The Baron demanded, and blood darkened his face. By your own count, Hawat said, he killed 15,000 over 2 years while losing twice that number. You say the Sardaukar accounted for another 20,000, possibly a few more. If they killed 20,000, they lost almost 5 for 1. Why won't you face these figures, Baron, and understand what they mean?
In this dialogue, an obvious ineffectiveness of modern methods gets highlighted. During the discussion of tactics and plans, a clear exchange of information and ideas, which is something you'd expect from a discourse between rational people, becomes impossible due to the Baron's insecurities.
My Lord Baron, if you wish to make the best use of my services, you must give me adequate information. Wasn't this conversation recorded? The Baron's face darkened with anger. You're as bad as Peiter. I don't like these. Peiter is no longer with you, my lord, Howard said. As to that, whatever did happen to Peiter? He became too familiar, too demanding of me.
The baggage of subconscious worms obstructs him from engaging in logical discourse. He gets offended by the honesty of Hawat and terrified by the discussion of things beyond his control. The dialogue with Harkonnen becomes unproductive, since each proposed idea, upon entering his mind, becomes warped with biases and insecurities. At any given moment, he might just snap and impulsively make a decision to kill his ally due to a randomly taken, unintended offense. The paradox of the Imperium is that the logic it teaches cannot be brought into existence by the very people it produces. Modernity compromises the capacity of a person to think logically by indulging in the development of his mental issues. Hawat himself, despite being a mentat, a knight of rationalism so to speak, demonstrates with his unfounded prejudice against Jessica how logic gets compromised in the modern world. By ignoring his animalistic side without coming to peace with his subconscious worms, he becomes their slave.
What a poisonous hate she must have had for the Atreides, he thought. Something like the hate I hold for this Baron.
The worms of hatred blind his rational judgment, leading to a mistake. That is why the plan he proposes to Harkonnen is doomed to fail, despite it seemingly being sound. In the dialogue with Jessica, Hawat reveals his prejudice against her and the Order of Bene Gesserit as a whole. The Mentat despises the religiousness of ancient methods, however, with his very prejudice that blinds him highlights their value. Only by passing the journey or initiation can you get an objective and sober look at reality unclouded by subconscious worms.
The natural human's an animal without logic. Your projections of logic onto all affairs is unnatural, but suffered to continue for its usefulness.
Purely out of indulgence, feeding his worms, Harkonnen wastes unimaginable wealth to destroy the House Atreides. What I find especially interesting is that almost all of that was done to get one solitary emotion out of Leto: fear, which Harkonnen fails to evoke. More than that, Harkonnen himself has experienced mortal dread when Leto cracked the poisonous tooth.
I'm still standing. I'm still breathing. Merciless hell, that was close.
The Baron is undoubtedly a talented politician, however he makes a questionable decision. He wastes such massive resources and does not even receive an ounce of satisfaction as a result. The subconscious worms are destroying him from the inside, preventing him from an effective rule, although he has all the necessary knowledge, skills, and resources. A significant detail is that in this very scene, Leto suffers not from fear but guilt, hearing screams of someone he mistakes to be his friend Duncan. So yeah, in this confrontational scene, both characters are eaten away by their own subconscious worms, but not by each other. The predictable refusal of the call by Baron occurs on Arrakis. Harkonnen isolates himself from the harsh planet by constructing a metaphorical cocoon of ordinary world around him.
Beyond these quarters, and enclosing him like a multi-shelled egg, stretched the space frigate he had grounded on Arrakis.
As was the case for his entire life, his wealth provides protection from the very thing that could possibly cure him. One of my favorite details that highlights just how powerful those subconscious worms are comes in form of Dr. Yu's betrayal. The diamond on his forehead is a sign of imperial brainwashing, implying it virtually impossible for him to be a traitor. It is the greatest attempt by the purists, the diamond kind of technology to suppress trauma, which fails. The worms of the unconscious are stronger than even the strongest of technological efforts to interfere with the human psyche. Yue betrays Atreides doing what was considered logically impossible. The monumental hatred of Yue towards Harkonnen, his hope for the life of his wife, his desire for revenge, his personal lament, all those feelings with which he has never even attempted to atone, opting for the rational, modern methods, tore him from the inside out. Even the greatest asset of logic fails when confronted by the dragons of the id. Unconsciousness is the most powerful aspect of the human psyche, which can destroy the man from the inside, like Leto, but which can also lend power for those that can channel it, like Paul. Yue becomes, as Campbell classifies it, a psychopath. A man who refused the call his entire life, becoming weakened spiritually, lives as a mere slave to his own shadow. An individual may try to remain good and kind while being neurotic, like Leto, but each positive action will take considerable toll on its enactor, draining him.
Presently he put on his mask of quiet efficiency, stood up, and commanded their attention with a knuckle rap against the table.
Gradually, Leto loses more and more of his control, first with his son, then with his guests, because it becomes increasingly more difficult to act normal when you are being torn apart by inner demons. Even though to a healthy mind, Paul, Jessica and Kynes, there's something effortless and natural. The fall of the House Atreides becomes not so much the result of Harkonnen's plot, but a natural consequence of the Leto's neurotic rule, which we perceived most vividly with his hysteric behavior during the dinner scene with the guests from chapter 16. Leto accompanies his drink with a sarcastic toast, mouthing the ideology of Imperium that he despises.
Business makes progress. Fortune passes everywhere.
This toast is the last straw of his rotten psyche. He can no longer hold back his weakness. Through his poem, he openly laments the lost old ways, the inevitability of death, the heartlessness of life. In that moment, he falls apart as a father, husband, and leader. His mask falls apart, revealing the rotten core.
He's angry and uncertain, Jessica thought. The loss of that factory crawler hit him more deeply than it should have. It must be something more than that loss.
Paul, on the other hand, mounts the worms both of Arrakis and his own id. Campbell differentiates the mystical and psychotherapeutic meaning of the journey. The aim of the religious teaching is not to cure the individual back to the general delusion, but to detach him from delusion altogether. And this not by readjusting the desire and hostility, for that would only originate a new context of delusion, but by extinguishing the impulses to the very root. And note that it is not a specific teaching, but the teaching's correlation to the planted in the collective unconsciousness symbolism that achieves it, which is commented by Jessica upon her initiation into the Reverend Mother of Fremen.
This wasn't exactly how they did it at the Bene Gesserit school, she knew. The end result was the same.
Paul hyperbolically represents the effect of using the subconscious worms for the acceleration and strengthening of one's consciousness. He, in exaggerated form, shows the power that a mentally healthy individual can possess in the land of neurotics via the two attributes, the voice and the visions. The voice is a special ability trained by Bene Gesserit. The woman chooses such a combination of tone, wording, pose, and gestures as to hack the unconsciousness of the targeted person, via leveraging his insecurities or desires, for example, and thus indoctrinate an idea on such a deep level that the mind would find it irresistible. Depending upon the relation to the journey, the individual might possess a different degree of control over the voice and susceptibility to it. Jessica is capable of influencing the people of Imperium, the Reverend Mother can influence her, and Paul can influence even the Reverend Mother herself. The voice is a metaphor of the unconscious influence that people have on each other. On the initiated Freeman, the voice doesn't work, but proves extremely effective on the neurotics of the Imperium, on Havad for instance. A man plagued by worms becomes a toy in the hands of a healthy person. This is exactly how Jessica uses the voice, consciously targeting the Eros and gaining control over the lustful Harkonnen soldiers.
She pitched her voice in low, intimate tones.
Gentlemen, no need to fight over me.
She saw them grow tense, knowing that in this instant they were convinced of the need to fight over her. Their disagreement required no other reason. In their minds they were fighting over her.
You mustn't disagree.
They drew farther apart, glanced warily at each other.
Is any woman worth fighting over?
By uttering the words, by being there, she made herself infinitely worth their fighting.
While Jessica incorporates her femininity into the voice, Paul utilizes his masculinity, an authoritative tone, leaving no choice but to obey.
Remove her gag.
Jessica felt the words rolling in the air. The tone, the timbre excellent, imperative, very sharp. A slightly lower pitch would have been better, but it could still fall within this man's spectrum.
The visions of Paul are not exactly the magical elements that they might appear at first, as they are a hyperbolic representation of brain activity, which is reflected in the way Paul describes them.
Some were separated from his mind, which went on in its steady pace, dealing with data, evaluating, computing, submitting answers in something like the Mentat way.
His mind dealing with data, the very wording is scientific. In an exaggerated form, his visions reveal the very essence of the tie between the psychological and mythological. By cultivating the power of it, by its submission to the superego and the death of ego in between, a man can reach the highest possible effectiveness of thought. All emotional, prejudiced veils that distort the observation of fact disappear, and the subconscious worms capable of rendering a person useless instead start helping him to deal with data. That which seemed unknowable becomes obvious. Paul saw his future with all its possible permutations of events.
I have another kind of sight. I see another kind of terrain. The available paths.
He also saw the whole system, the whole of the human condition as it is.
The thing was a spectrum of possibilities from the most remote past to the most remote future, from the most probable to the most improbable. He saw his own death in countless ways. He saw new planets, new cultures, people. He saw them in such swarms they could not be listed, yet his mind catalogued them.
That which is not part of data that is known to him is not processed. Which is why, even though he just saw the whole of the human nature, as well as realized the secrets of Imperium, he was surprised to see Shani after his 3-week-long trance.
Muad'Dib could indeed see the future, but you must understand the limits of this power. Think of sight. You have eyes, yet cannot see without light.
It is actually something I deeply love about Dune, that it has no purely magical or supernatural element. Every aspect of it is basically an exaggeration of a specific scientific notion. Both the voice and visions are just hyperboles of eloquence and deep thinking. That said, while Harkonnen, Leto, and Havad represent various stages of neurosis, Jessica and Stilgar represent the mentally healthy people, but with different degrees of wisdom. Paul, unlike the rest of the cast, is a mystic, detached from the healthy mentality just as severely as a neurotic, but in a positive manner, so to speak. As Grove says, where psychotic drowns, a mystic swims. Paul and Jessica both undergo the death of ego, crossing the boundaries between the ordinary and the other worlds. But Jessica resurrects her ego at the completion of the journey, becoming a normal person again. Paul's ego does not get resurrected after his return. He becomes a monomythic beacon of the other in the ordinary world, changing it, becoming a messiah and forming a new religion of Imperium, as well as cosmogonically resurrecting the world. The gradient of psychological profiles would not be complete without taking into account the two anomalous characters, which represent the distilled absolutes of their respective worlds. Count Fenring and Alia, Paul's sister. Count Fenring is the right hand of the Emperor, the single strongest fighter in the whole Imperium, and a eunuch. Due to that last part, he is symbolically severed from the cosmogony. His subconscious worms were killed via castration. Id, as an aspect of his psyche, was symbolically destroyed. Unclouded by the worm's consciousness, has absorbed all the instruments and skills of the Imperium, reaching the absolute maximum effectiveness an individual could possess. He becomes the embodiment of distilled strengths of Imperium and the rational methods of modernity. Technology, logic, skill, cunning, intrigue, all that which every other character have to use through the filter of their unconsciousness, be it healthy like Paul's or ill like Fade's. Fenring, who has deadened within himself the id, can utilize those tools directly. Interesting that, thanks to his unclouded perception of reality, Fenring sees the necessity of the world's cosmogonical rebirth, in that agreeing with the spiritual Bene Gesserit, which is why he allows Paul to overthrow the Emperor, despite having the ability to easily stop him. Alia is a girl who was born with the wisdom of a reverend mother. Jessica drank the water of life while being pregnant, thus submitting the embryo to its effect. Alia becomes enlightened from the very birth, embodying the absolute of the unconscious spiritual power of Arrakis, just like Fenring embodies the absolute of Imperium. To summarize so far, through the exaggeration, voice, and visions, separation of spaces of the conscious and the subconscious, Imperium and Arrakis, usage of the mythological symbolism, world's navel, dragons, mana, water of life, trance, ritual, etc., Dune demonstrates in hyperbolic form the psychological dynamics of both the inner and outer world of an array of characters of different mental health, and visit the mechanism of a psychological development of those characters, actualization of unconscious archetypes, thus forming a gradient of different psychological portraits. In the previous chapter, we've outlined some of the binary oppositions of Dune: the technology versus the ritual, individualism versus the totemic worldview, consciousness versus unconsciousness, logic, myth, etc. In each of them, the positive side seemed to be the right one: Arrakis, Fremen, ritual, the ancient methods. However, such unambiguous preference will lead to a much simpler version of the relation between the Imperium and Arrakis, corresponding to Yang and Yin, than the one presented in the book. Even though Arrakis has its giant worms, Imperium has the equally giant guild spaceships. The totemic culture of Fremen, which brings up people with healthy psyche, is also a culture that is incapable of standing up against the Imperium's oppression. As the rich Imperials suffer from neurosis while living in luxury, the mentally healthy Fremen, who live in harmony with their inner worlds, suffer from the material want, with the reason for this being their detachment from politics, science, and economy. They are just as susceptible to the simplest tricks and logical arguments as citizens of Imperium are to the voice. For instance, they pay the guild off with spice instead of blackmailing them with its destruction. Their very faith, the basis of rituals that give them such unconscious power, are the products of Bene Gesserit's indoctrination. Thousands of years ago they had artificially planted that faith into the Fremen culture. Jessica and Paul, as politically literate individuals, were capable of manipulating Fremen's religious superstitions to use them for their own purposes.
Such people would be easy to imbue with fervor and fanaticism. They could be wielded like a sword to win back Paul's place for him.
Just as strong as Fremen are in the unconscious, they are weak in the conscious aspect. This juxtaposition is reflected through the final confrontation between Paul and Fade, where we perceive the clashing of the two principles. Despite Paul being the master of both worlds, in his combat he relies exclusively on his unconscious training, aspect more in tune with Arrakis. Jessica suggests a trick identical to the one that Fade used during the gladiatorial battle. However, Paul refuses to use it because easy paths lead to the corrupting comfort.
And always, he fought the temptation to choose a clear, safe course, warning, that path leads ever down into stagnation.
In battle, Fade once again depends upon a secret weapon, a trick. Fade tries to force a conversation onto Paul, thus attempting to dominate an opponent through external, material deceptions. Paul remains silent, does not use any secret tricks, but focuses on Fade, allowing his unconsciousness to figure his opponent out in a similar to Vision's fashion. Unconscious dominance of the inner world is exaggerated through the ability of Paul to dissolve the poison from the blade of Fade. No matter what type of metaphorical poison is imparted within the world of inner harmony, the hero will not succumb to it. Thus Fade, the champion of Imperium, uses the tools of influencing his opponent. Paul, the champion of Arrakis, the tools of influencing oneself. Quite surprisingly, the victory does not come easy to Paul. The poor mystic was a hairbreadth away from dying in combat with the rich neurotic. Jessica's cunning was indeed that which turned the tide of combat to Paul's advantage, although not directly. Paul screamed, "I will not say that word," which knocked the confused Fade off guard. Jessica's trick, empowering a healthy psyche, was what allowed Paul to snatch the victory from Fade. Without it, Paul and Fade would be equals in combat, which signifies the equal value of both Imperium and Arrakis, both yang and yin for the human condition. Imperium, with technology, logic, tactics, martial arts, politics, etc., provides an individual with the tools capable of both spoiling him with comfort and empowering him with strength. Arrakis, with ritual, myth, trials, etc., provides the guidance to achieve inner peace, which does allow one to get used to the unfair living conditions, like Fremen, but also to use the tools of the Imperium to their maximum effect, like Paul. A rich neurotic is incapable of effectively using the abilities which are available to him in Imperium, while the capable for such effectiveness Fremen simply do not have the access to them. Paul, passing the journey and becoming the master of both worlds, perfects his potential. He is capable of effectively using the entire cultural capital of Imperium by achieving an enlightened state of being on Arrakis. Uniting the strengths of both worlds, he gains the power to overthrow the tyrant of the universe, the Emperor. Realizing his potential as a harmonious human being, Paul reveals the meaning of his surname, Atreides. Paul is the ancient Greek ideal of an individual, the balance of material and spiritual, unrestrained by morality in pursuit of restoring the Golden Age. The part about morality becomes most evident if we directly compare Paul to another Atreides, his father, who had also pursued the path to antique harmony, albeit a misguided one. While Leto succumbed to the conviction of Jessica and interrupted his own journey, Paul has walked to its very end, not yielding to any temptation. While Leto obeyed the Emperor, Paul was leading a revolt against him. While Leto prioritized the well-being of his peers and the morality of his conducts above the results, Paul was not bothered by such concerns, using civilian refugees as human shield and employing the use of a forbidden nuclear weapon.
But the injunction against the injunction, Paul barked. It's fear, not the injunction, that keeps the houses from hurling atomics against each other.
However, despite such despicable actions, it was Paul who became the hero of future myth. The one who overthrew the tyrant and restored the House Atreides to the former glory, after it has been destroyed under the rule of moral Leto. Leto's weakness is most evident in his juxtaposition to Harkonnen. At first glance, out of the two, a definitive hero is Leto with his moral code. However, within the dynamic of the plot, Leto is placed below Harkonnen. He is just as neurotic of a tyrant, his leadership is even questioned by his troops, although not nearly as talented a politician due to the code of honor holding him back. Despite his placement as the moral center of the story, and in fact, because of it, Leto has failed to become proficient in either world, remaining a master of none. Leto failed the journey due to his political reasoning and failed to become a successful politician due to his morality and conscience. When a banker tries to offend Kynes, a Fremen, pointing at the immoral actions of his kind,
"It's said that the Fremens come drink the blood of their dead,"
he responds with,
"Not the blood, sir, but all of a man's water ultimately belongs to his people, to his tribe."
In the Campbell's work, similar to Nietzsche, concepts of good and evil are mere illusions, which have no place in the other world, totemic worldview has no morality, and in the ordinary. In capitalistic society, that man gets to the top who is not afraid of getting his hands dirty with corruption, bribery, and other dirty methods. Campbell, in one of his most provocative segments, retells a story of a mystic who saw a woman as she consumed her newborn child. He comments that only a person prepared can perceive the beauty of such a scene. The mystical world of the unconscious deep sleep operates via principles that to those who live in the ordinary world like Leto seem savage, horrible, and terrifying. However, comprehension and acceptance of such archaic rules is an important step towards achieving spiritual enlightenment. The Iliad, to which the name of Atreides is an allusion, depicts what to us seems like a distinctly amoral worldview, in which there is no mercy for the weak, no justice for the virtuous, and where the strongest is always correct and divine, despite his conduct. Paul, like Achilles, doesn't let morality stand in his way to victory. Although, unlike the Greek hero, he doesn't let vengeance blind him, instead corresponding to the Stoic teachings of Marcus Aurelius. Embodying such an amalgamation of antique ideals, Paul becomes the greatest character in the system of Dune. The masculine and feminine principles, or animus and anima, are another binary opposition of the novel.
There is in each of us an ancient force that takes and an ancient force that gives. A man finds little difficulty facing that place within himself where the taking force dwells. But it's almost impossible for him to see into the giving force without changing into something other than man. For a woman, the situation is reversed.
The Reverend Mother becomes a spiritual nexus of a matriarchal society of Fremen. The Guild Corporation stands at the top of a patriarchal society of Imperium. Those matriarchal and patriarchal worlds in Dune mark the duality of feminine and masculine. Jessica, upon becoming the Reverend Mother, while deep in her trance, gets terrified by the masculine taking aspect of her psyche, although finds harmony and peace with her feminine, given side. Paul nearly dies in the 3-week-long trance while exploring the feminine principle, but conquers the male one within a minute. Upon reaching the apex of his enlightenment, Paul unites within himself both the masculine and the feminine principles, thus returning to the described in the Symposium myth of a perfect androgynous human being.
"And you, my son?" Jessica asked. "Are you one who gives, or one who takes?" "I'm at the fulcrum," he said. "I cannot give without taking, and I cannot take without..."
Contrary to classical attribution, the spiritual in Dune is the feminine principle, while the material is masculine. Through Paul's visions, which let us get a glimpse of his inner world, we can distinguish yet another binary opposition of a novel, the plane of matter, which incorporates both Arrakis and Imperium, and the Platonic plane of ideals. The deeper Paul delves into the other, the stronger the pull he feels to escape within himself.
Awareness flowed into that timeless stratum where he could view time, sensing the available paths, the one-eyed vision of the past, the one-eyed vision of the present, and the one-eyed vision of the future, all combined in a trinocular vision that permitted him to see time become space.
This state of being reaches its climax in his 3-week-long trance. Campbell writes of a danger that the mystic might lose his tie to reality. The shaman might go into a trance and never come back, becoming lost in the other world. Paul has to consciously hold on to this mortal plane in the here and now.
There was danger, he felt, of overrunning himself, and he had to hold on to his awareness of the present, sensing the blurred deflection of experience, the flowing moment, the continual solidification of that which is into the perpetual was.
This escape into the plane of ideals gets explored with the two ivory towers, the Guild of Imperium and the Reverend Mother of Arrakis. The Guild is an organization that holds complete monopoly over the interplanetary travel. They require the consciousness-expanding spice to perform the overwhelming amount of calculations required for such an enterprise, which marks the main difference between the Guild members and the regular Imperials. Guild understands the practical value of spirituality and wisdom, while the rich Imperials consider spice as a luxury. For the intellectual elite of the Guild, spice is a necessary aspect of everyday life. Guild members consume spice in the same, if not higher amounts than Fremen do.
As the Emperor watched, someone jostled the guildsman's arm, the hand moved, and the eye was revealed. The man had lost one of his masking contact lenses, and the eye stared out a total blue, so dark as to be almost black.
But they do so in secret from the rest of the world so as to maintain their corporate monopoly, remaining the only group intellectually capable of conducting interplanetary travel. The monumental power they get from this puts them above even the Emperor, who is but a puppet in their hands.
Paul turned back to look at the Emperor.
When they permitted you to mount your father's throne, it was only on the assurance that you'd keep the spice flowing.
They are the unreachable elite of society, who maintain spiritual rituals and secret wisdom in their caste, but do not disclose this wisdom to the populace, thus condemning the Imperium to remain the kingdom of death. any of the guild members could become the next hero that would reinvigorate the world and unite Arrakis with Imperium. However, they prefer to remain in their ivory tower. The guild members are heroes that refuse the call of the return, consciously leaving the reins of a tyranny in the hands of Shaddam. Every guild member stands on the same level of spirituality as Paul.
We cannot know how it will go. And the taller companion, hand restored to eye, added in a cold voice, but this Muad'Dib cannot know either.
The only difference between them and Paul is that they've been living in the ether of a purely spiritual life for so long that they have completely lost the connection to the material, real plane.
The words shocked the Emperor out of his daze. He checked the scorn on his tongue by a visible effort, because it did not take a guild navigator's single-minded focus on the main chance to see the immediate future out on that plane. Were these two so dependent upon their faculty that they had lost the use of their eyes and their reason?
The guild members remaining in their ivory tower, despite the harmony of wealth and spirit, lost sight of reality, fully concentrating on the abstract, speculative world of ideals. However, it is the guild that supports the very fundament of Imperium, without which it would collapse into anarchy.
The guild is crippled. Humans become little isolated clusters on their isolated planets.
Without wisdom, spice, intellectuals, the guild members would not be able to maintain the fundament of knowledge, interplanetary travel, upon which rests our civilization, Imperium. The ivory tower of Arrakis is the reverent mother of Fremen. Just how the guild functions as the fundament of Imperium's material prosperity, she serves as the spiritual catalyst of Arrakis. It is the reverent mother that serves the ritualistic orgies with the consumption of the purified water of life, which remains poisonous until the mother processes it. Those ritualistic orgies serve as tribe's collective sublimation of libido or id, which is also described by Campbell. If the shaman disappears, the ritual would lose its sanctity, and thus the tribe would enter a collective neurosis, which is certain to lead them to extinction in the harsh environment of Arrakis. Another essential binary position of the novel is harmony and chaos. The vivid contrast between Arrakis and Imperium is, in large part, so observable because the world of Dune remains in disharmony. A utopia of this world would be a unification of those two spaces, Imperium with its prosperity and Arrakis with its spirituality. The opposite of such a utopia, true chaos, is the already mentioned technological catastrophe from the backstory of Dune. Both the inhabitants of Arrakis and Imperium suffer from disharmony of body and soul. No matter how spiritual Fremen are, they remain the living inhabitants of the kingdom of death. Rich Imperials are the opposite, spiritually dead individuals in healthy bodies. The greater the difference between those two spaces becomes, modernity forgets the ancient ways, while the tribal withers in increasingly harsh conditions, the closer the world gets to the true chaos, a repetition of the catastrophe. Besides the ivory towers, in accordance to Eastern philosophy, in both spaces of Dune, yin and yang, exists a seed of the other. Bene Gesserit's order is one such seed, an isle of spirituality in Imperium, while Kynes' family is an isle of rationalism in the space of Arrakis. Just like Bene Gesserit tried to create a hero, Kynes tried to terraform Arrakis, turning it into an Eden through science and logic.
Jessica felt the religious ritual in the words. This is the scientist's dream, and these simple people, these peasants, are filled with it.
It is from those very seeds that the cosmogonic hero appears. Paul gets brought up in Imperium in the tradition of Bene Gesserit, which allow him to survive in the other world, and it is the Isle of Rationalism and Kynes himself which allows Paul to become an eventual Fremen leader. If the world had delved deeper into chaos before the coming of Paul, losing those seeds of yin and yang, the hero might not have been able to undergo the journey, and thus the world would be doomed for the cosmogonic catastrophe. We can already see the start of their deterioration. Both isles of the other in the ordinary slowly get corrupted with their environments. The spiritual Bene Gesserit start experimenting with genetic engineering, while their motives become increasingly more political.
You think to control human breeding and intermix a select few according to your master plan.
Liet Kynes start to resemble a Fremen more than his father, who was a true scientist of Imperium. Paul restores harmony by rejuvenating both worlds. He brings the material into the spiritual, political reforms of Arrakis, and the spiritual into the material, a new religion of Imperium. Very apparent, the dynamic between spaces and their representatives can be seen in chapter 47. Baron, as a man who survives exclusively because of his privileged position, drowning his subconscious worms with wealth, feels vulnerable when he loses it, if only for a moment.
Fear sat like a stone in his stomach until he could hardly bear the thought of eating. Yet the feeling was like hunger, and he poised himself several times in his suspenses on the point of ordering food brought to him. But there was no one here to obey his summons.
Harkonnen also perceives Fremen religious fanaticism as mere madness, since the spiritual axis of existence remains completely beyond his field of sight. Shaddam, more spiritual than the Baron, recognizes danger in such fanaticism. For the character of Harkonnen, this scene is important, because here, for the first time, he stumbles upon the irrevocable proof of the practical value of spirituality.
"But that's impossible," the Baron protested. "The worms! There's sand clear to the—" "These people seem able to avoid the worms," the Emperor said.
The world he viewed as one-dimensional, seeing only the hierarchy of power, suddenly gets a second dimension in which he finds himself to be at the lowest point. His undeniable intellect and cunning, developed for the rationalistic world, become non-viable in the world of both body and spirit. His death from the sting of Gom Jabbar, which kills only animals, symbolizes the inevitable fall of a neurotic tyrant, who indulges his subconscious worms with wealth. Harkonnen could not survive in a fight with a 5-year-old girl. In the same scene, Shaddam rejects the notion that Fremen could attack, because from a tactical standpoint, this attack would have no chance of success. His arrival at Arrakis corresponds with the crossing of the threshold in the Monomyth, but what's presently more important is that he now entered a different hierarchy, in which he finds himself to be lower than Fremen. Despite Shaddam being spiritually stronger than Harkonnen, he is still mentally unsound. While the mother and Alia saw that the Baron's actions are predicated on his naivety, Emperor mistakenly considers them cunning.
"Do not abuse my intelligence any longer. You stand there in your foolish innocence and—" "Majesty?" the old truthsayer said. He waved her to silence. "You say you don't know about the activity we found, nor the fighting qualities of these superb people." The Emperor lifted himself half off his throne. "What do you take me for, Baron?"
Despite the attempts of both women to point out the error of his judgment, he, in his tyrannical pride, which is a subconscious worm by the way, turns a deaf ear to their advice. In his rationality, he believes that by taking Alia hostage, he received an unbeatable card, an instrument of perfect blackmail.
"Perhaps you've never sought the right kind of hostages."
Paul, contrary to his expectations, never even slows down. The Reverend Mother is distinguished by the unrivaled spiritual strength within the space of Imperium. However, by meeting Alia, she encounters a pure embodiment of spirit.
Even the old Bene Gesserit truthsayer drew back as the child passed and made a warding sign in her direction. The old witch obviously was shaken by the child's presence.
That to which the mother has worked her entire life towards through ritual and training, Alia carries within herself from birth. Conversely, the simplest rules and terms of the Imperium, which mother takes for granted, for Alia are completely unknown. In confrontation with both the Emperor and Baron, Alia, due to her enlightened psyche, accumulation of the subconscious worm's positive effect, becomes the verbal and physical victor. While the Emperor considers her to be his trophy, she doesn't even perceive him as a threat, operating on a level unreachable for Shaddam and his cohorts.
"I allowed myself to be captured," the child said. "I did not want to face my brother and have to tell him that his son had been killed."
When the mother loses control over herself from the influence of Alia, Shaddam reveals his naivety.
"TP?" the Emperor whispered. He snapped his attention back to Alia. "By the Great Mother! What others?" the Emperor demanded. "What's this nonsense?"
Within the microcosm of this one scene, we can clearly see the two hierarchies of Dune at play. First, the one of the material space of Imperium. We have Alia at the bottom, then Mother, then Harkonnen, and finally the Emperor. And the second hierarchy, the one of the spiritual space of Arrakis. Harkonnen now the lowest, then the Emperor, the Mother, and at the top, Alia. Through the chaotic and unproductive interaction, the miscommunication between those characters, we can perceive the degree of disharmony that affects both worlds of Dune. For instance, Alia has an influence on the Mother due to their proximity along the axis, but she cannot have the same effect on the rooted in Imperium Shaddam.
"Child, can you truly project your thoughts into the mind of another?" "That's not how it is at all," Alia said. "Unless I'm born as you, I cannot think as you."
Similarly, when trying to press Alia down with authority, Emperor gets no result. Let's summarize the system of Dune so far. The horizontal opposition of Imperium and Arrakis marks the duality of human condition, yin and yang. Those spaces are equal in value, for they are both needed for the survival of an individual and the humanity as a whole. They also represent the two halves of the hypothetical utopia, material wealth and spiritual depth. Each character has a different placement along the hierarchies of both spaces. Paul, representing the antique ideal, reaches his maximum potential as a human being, achieving the perfect balance between those two sides. The disharmony of Dune's world is a direct result of the ever-growing distance between those spaces. The true chaos, which this world rapidly approaches, is characterized by a total separation of those spaces, both incapable of surviving on their own. Also worth noting that in the logic of Dune, morality is a false ideal. The material plane, Arrakis and Imperium, is juxtaposed vertically with an ideal plane, towards which are directed the two ivory towers of those spaces, the Guild and the Reverend Mother appropriately. The Guild and the Mother are the integral for the survival of Imperium and Arrakis nexuses, the temples of their cultures. In each of the spaces there is a seed of the other, Bene Gesserit in Imperium and Kansas on Arrakis. In the dynamic between characters we can perceive the interaction of those spaces, as well as the disharmonious state in which Dune currently exists. In the context of Dune, journey implies two transformations. First, psychotherapy of potential or existing neurosis on an unconscious level, and second, raising the capital on the conscious level. In the hypothetical utopia of Dune, the passing of the journey would be a part of a regular life for each inhabitant of either space. Every single person, as a result, would become a hero. In Dune, however, the connection between the spaces is all but lost, and those the journey accidentally walked and those rediscovered by Paul puts him into a category of a cosmogonic hero who reinvigorates the universe. Important to mention that, although Imperium and Arrakis, representing yin and yang, are equal aspects of the human condition, within the narrative of the novel these spaces are not exactly balanced. Arrakis is but one planet within the Imperium, and the space we've been characterizing so far does not even cover its entirety. Only Fremen correlate to the archetype I have described. Cities, villages, and castles of Arrakis are marked by characteristics of the Imperium space. So, the disharmony of Dune manifests itself not only through the lost connection between the spaces, but also through their disproportional sizes. In the World of Dune, at the time the narrative takes place, rationalism is exalted, while spirituality is demonized. To a citizen of Imperium, Fremen are no more than savages. Shaddam, being the emperor and due to his cosmogonic role, a mediator between the two spaces, Campbell's Master of Two Worlds, shows a biased preference for the Imperium space, disregarding Arrakis. This stance of the emperor is what characterizes him as a cosmic tyrant, leading the World of Dune to chaos through his rule. This harmony also manifests itself in the fact that the crowned mediator of the worlds is placed lower in the hierarchy of power than the guild. Paul, by overthrowing him and becoming the new emperor, ostentatiously takes a stand as a ruler who shall give equal attention to both spaces, not to mention subjugates the guild. Paul restores harmony, performing the role of a cosmic hero. Through his example and teaching, he presents the Imperials with a way out of neurosis, as well as helps the restoration and spread of Arrakis culture.
This Fremen religious adaptation, then, is the source of what we now recognize as the pillars of the universe.
However, to restore harmony between the worlds, Paul has to commit the single most immoral deed of the story, the jihad. Before I elaborate on that, I should point out that in the continuations of the book, Paul does gradually become a tyrant, just like Shaddam, who, in retrospect, appears as a fallen hero. It's implied that he had passed the hero's journey at some point in his youth. His soldier's attire and the command over the Sardaukar are signs of his former heroism. Paul's downfall depicts not the failure of cosmogony, as some researchers consider it to be, but the very opposite, a standard turn of the cosmic wheel of Dune. The utopia between the spaces of yin and yang was, from the offset, impossible. Worms of Arrakis who create spice can only survive in a lifeless desert. Water kills them. So, if, in accordance to the Fremen dream, you turn Arrakis green, the worms would die out and spice would disappear. The ships would not fly. The ritualistic society, born out of harsh conditions, would also disappear in the newly regained paradise together with the spice and wisdom. Worms will be drowned in the water of material prosperity, just like the neurosis of Harkonnen was with wealth. As a result, people will, once again, forget the ancient methods, and the world will lose harmony and balance. Yang will again dominate over Ying. The hypothetical achievement of utopia would lead to the very same catastrophe as does the tyrannic rule. Fremen will die out, Imperials will become slaves of the machines. The resulting cosmogonic cycle of Dune consists of the following steps. The regenerated world blooms. Water fills the wastelands of Arrakis, allowing the spiritual Fremen to live in comfort. The Imperium, receiving the hero emperor, also rejuvenates, with the Fremen teaching brought to its citizens. However, prosperity and comfort spoils Fremen, drowns wisdom and warmth in wealth. The world's navel becomes distorted. The hero becomes a tyrant. Imperium forgets the spiritual teachings because Fremen themselves start to forget them. The universe once again plunges into the kingdom of death. World's navel gradually turns into the desert, and her inhabitants have to again rediscover spiritual ways in hopes that another hero will come from the other world, goes through their initiatory rituals, and returns back to his home, regenerating the universe again, thus letting the wheel start yet another turn. The true chaos becomes just as improbable in extremity as a pure utopia. The more disassociated the spaces become, the greater the guild's need for spice, and so the more people will be sent to Arrakis, voluntarily like smugglers or forcibly like Atreides, thus gaining a chance to pass the hero's journey. If a solitary individual were to pass such a journey, he would receive the power equal to that of Paul, and through his mere existence rejuvenates the world. Dune paints a binary system. The closer the spaces get to one another, the stronger they get pushed apart. However, the further they separate, the greater the chance of a hero's appearance. The hero will then forcefully, through jihad, unite the spaces again, becoming the savior later turned tyrant. This concludes the cosmogonic cycle of Dune. The enlightened Paul recognizes his own status and makes several attempts at altering this cycle. Number 1. He wants to terraform Arrakis, but also keep its ecosystem and culture intact.
There will be flowing water here, open to the sky, and green oases rich with good things. But we have the spice to think of too. Thus, there will always be desert on Arrakis, and fierce winds, and trials to toughen a man.
Number 2. Campbell writes that the hero emperor has to commit an act of self-sacrifice, leaving his rule to future generations. Otherwise, the world will become the kingdom of death. Paul decides to leave the reins over the Imperium to his children, exiling into the desert, and thus by doing so trying to aid the cosmogonic cycle of Dune, since a tyrant would rule until he is overthrown. However, his children become just as tyrannical as Paul would be. One of his children commits a genocide of the Arrakis populace, thus destroying the Fremen culture, achieving the same results that Paul's turning the planet green would have done. Number 3. Paul tried to prevent the jihad.
Now, standing beside his mother on the cavern ledge and looking out at the throng, he wondered if any plan could prevent the wild outpouring of fanatic legions.
But realized that even if he and other Fremen leaders were to die, jihad would still be inevitable.
If he died this instant, the thing would go on through his mother and his unborn sister, nothing less than the deaths of all the troop gathered here, and now, himself and his mother included, could stop the thing.
As we can see, even the deliberate resistance of an almost omnipotent being is incapable of interfering with the turning wheel of human civilization.
And Paul saw how futile were any efforts of his to change any smallest bit of this. He had thought to oppose the jihad within himself, but the jihad would be. His legions would rage out from Arrakis even without him. They needed only the legend he already had become.
The rise and fall of empires, the coming and going of the new religions, doctrines, teachings, philosophies, which is a cycle that gets commented by Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the turning of the human condition and being along the cosmic circle will never change, and will never lose its inherent pain, which in Dune is symbolized with the inevitable disharmony which brings the inevitable suffering of both neurotics and the poor, and the inevitable jihad. The technological catastrophe in the past had also ended with the jihad.
And the race knew only one sure way for this, the ancient way, the tried and certain way that rolled over everything in its path. Jihad.
Paul had tried to alter the nature of the human condition, but his actions have had no effect. A number of characters, specifically Paul, Jessica, Leto and Kynes, experience a moment of revelation, in which they glimpse the core principle of the universe beyond both the plane of Arrakis and Imperium spaces and the plane of ideals. They realize that the objective universe operates under the nihilistic principle of the accident.
Alia opened her eyes. "That is how it was," she said. "A cosmic accident, and you played your part in it."
Liet Kynes, who lived his life in accordance to the ancient rituals without making a solitary cosmic mistake, always going down the hardest path, who bravely ventured into the other world, who surpassed each and every trial on his hero's journey, dies pointlessly in the desert. According to myth and plain common sense, he shouldn't have died. He was supposed to be found by Fremen, and even if not, he knows how to survive in the desert. But he happens to fall down from exhaustion at the exact location of an erupting underground geyser, which is a mere coincidence. The very fact of him dying from water in a desert is paradoxical and contradicts the described in this analysis dynamic of spaces, but it is the dying thoughts of Kynes that become key to understanding the significance of his death.
Then, as his planet killed him, it occurred to Kynes that his father and all the other scientists were wrong, that the most persistent principles of the universe were accident and error.
All things are ruled by chance. Why was the neurotic Harkonnen able to live such a long life while Paul's son dies an infant? The first was lucky to be born into wealth and was equally lucky to not encounter a situation, for decades, mind you, in which he would have to survive. As soon as he did stumble into such a situation, he died to a child. Why Fremen, despite their readiness, cannot pass the hero's journey? Because the nihilistic universe does not allow them an opportunity for such a journey. However strong the ability to get the most out of any situation, if the situation simply doesn't happen, the person can't get anything out of it. Paul became a messiah because he was lucky. Accidental events of his life coincided into a corresponding to Monomyth's journey.
But never have we seen a condition ut extremis with more ideal mating of person and preparation. The prophetic legends had taken on Arrakis, even to the extent of adopted labels.
If, at any stage of his journey, his luck were to run out, Paul would become a failed hero or die.
What if there isn't one of the abandoned testing stations across there? He wondered. What if there are no Fremen either, and the plants we see are only an accident?
One of the main reasons why the author chose to make two characters undergoing hand-in-hand exactly the same path is to reveal the element of random chance. The only difference between them is that Paul was lucky to have received an opportunity to return to the ordinary world at the stage of the call of the return, while Jessica simply did not have such an opportunity. Her journey has ended despite her will. She was just out of luck. What value is then in those described rituals, myths, and cultural capital when all is ruled by chance? A person who acquired harmony with his inner self and subjugated his shadow, id, subconscious worms has a greater chance of survival when confronted with accident than a neurotic. Compare Leto and Harkonnen to Jessica and Paul. Such a person has better chance of survival than an animal. A beast would have snatched its paw out of the box and died to Gom Jabbar, but a human would not. Human survives where animal dies, showing the value of self-control in the world of chance. Mythology, religion, ritual, all those are tools for the development of human capacity for survival.
The mind can go either direction under stress, toward positive or toward negative, on or off. Think of it as a spectrum whose extremes are unconsciousness at the negative end and hyperconsciousness at the positive end. The way the mind will lean under stress is strongly influenced by training.
The man's belief in the truthfulness of myth is what gives him its strength. For Fremen, capable of surviving the harshest conditions with the strength they've acquired through ritual and myth, the Reverend Mother is the ultimate testament to the absolute truthfulness of their beliefs, reassuring them that nothing is accidental and for everything there is a reason. A foretold Messiah will come and he will overthrow the tyrant. For them it cannot be otherwise.
And the thought of coincidence never entered their minds.
Jessica, becoming a Reverend Mother, experiences on herself, in a literal sense, the benefit of rituals.
The great mass of the people could never hope to attain the enlightenment the spice seed brought to her. They had not been trained and prepared for it.
However, in her inner monologue, she comments that the survival of her son, the supposed invulnerable Messiah of Fremen, in the mountain of the worm is a matter of chance.
Has Paul passed his test on the sand? Jessica asked herself. He's capable, but accident can strike down even the most capable.
Paul himself, during the fight with James, in his vision sees that future is uncertain. He may die, he may survive. The future depends on chance.
He tells us that a single obscure decision of prophecy, perhaps the choice of one word over another, could change the entire aspect of the future.
For the Fremen, his victory is preordained, as is everything in their religious worldview. Were they to lose their blind faith and culture, they would have died on this harsh planet. More than that, if Paul or Jessica were to realize the make-believe nature of spiritual ways, of ritual, faith and myth, before they've undergone the psychological metamorphosis as a result of their direct influence, they would not have the capacity to survive the very events that brought them to power. The same goes for the opposite principle of the human condition, the yen of the Imperium. A man with a weapon or skills, the instruments of logic and technology, has a greater chance of survival in confrontation with an animal than an unprepared person. Humankind, as a species, has a greater chance of survival in a universe of cosmic coincidence when armed with the tools of modern civilization. The greater the technological, cultural, and social level of humanity, the better it can oppose the cosmic accidents. For us, the death of our planet is the death of humankind, but for the Imperium of Dune, such a catastrophe would barely be noticeable. The fake, artificially formed, and completely not reflective of the true nature of reality human condition, paradoxically, becomes the very thing that allows people, individuals and humankind as a whole, to survive and thrive in this universe of cosmic accident. as Leto realized in his dying epiphany.
One thought remained to him. Later saw it in formless light on rays of black. The day the flesh shapes, and the flesh the day shapes. The thought struck him with a sense of fullness he knew he could never explain. Silence.
This system of Imperium and Arrakis, yin and yang, born through the evolution of the human species, is a natural reaction to the chaotic universe of the accident. And, at the same time, it is now something that can influence the said universe. Humanity having the capacity to terraform and destroy entire planets. The objective reality of chance underlying the events of Dune becomes most evident when we take into account the short story from the supplementary materials to the novel. The story of Kynes' father, a planetologist that tries to lay the foundation for the terraforming of Arrakis, is told as a historic summary. A series of facts devoid of the personalized narrative from the point of a character's view. It provides a look at Dune not filtered through a psychology of any given character. The difference in style of writing between this story and the main text allows us to see its objective reality. Worms are not the mythological dragons, but merely a part of Arrakis' ecosystem. Spice is not the essence of wisdom which leads to the spiritual growth, but merely a resource of the planet, the excrement of worms. Kynes' story is an essential element of the novel's artistic identity, since it demonstrates how Dune would look devoid of mythological symbolism and psychological dynamic. Kynes' story is Dune, but without Arrakis as a principal space. If the story of Kynes shows us Dune through an isolated lens of Imperium, the lens of logic, science, and rationality, then the Manual of Muad'Dib shows us a retelling of the Dune's plot, but through the lens of a pure myth. Campbell comments that the great events of the past turn into myths and legends in the minds of the descendants, forming what he calls a spiritual guide. The myth of Paul exhibits such a mythologizing. Every event in his life gets recontextualized as a natural, inevitable, and divine. All characters of his story lose their psychological depths, being reduced to the archetypical roles they've played in his life. The father, the mother, the betrayer, the teacher, the tyrant, and so on. Just like Kynes' story, the Manual of Muad'Dib loses the specific psychological depths of the main text, which is based on the duality of conscious and unconscious embodied in the principal spaces of Imperium and Arrakis. The Manual of Muad'Dib captures the isolated, mythological, unconscious, spiritual aspect of Dune's system, and Kynes' story isolated, rational, conscious, logical aspect. The main text unites those two sides in its narrative, showing the system in its complexity, while also outlining the objective universe of coincidence upon which humankind merely projects this system. An important characteristic of the simplified retelling of Paul's life in the Manual of Muad'Dib is that this book changes any fact of his biography that does not coincide with the normal pattern of a religious myth.
And take the most special care that you locate Muad'Dib in his place, the planet Arrakis. Do not be deceived by the fact that he was born on Caladan and lived his first 15 years there. Arrakis, the planet known as Dune, is forever his place.
Campbell mentions that the place of hero's birth in mythological thinking is the world's navel. The place of hero's birth, or the remote land of exile from which he returns to perform his adult deeds among men, is the midpoint or navel of the world. Just as the ripples go out from an underwater spring, so the forms of the universe expand in circles from this source. In accordance to that approach, in the mythologized biography, the place of hero's birth gets shifted from Caladan to Arrakis. The most vivid example of such alterations in the Manual of Muad'Dib is the depiction of Paul's reaction to his son's death and Alia's kidnapping, which is the opposite of the one we see in the main text. In the myth, Paul seemed to realize some kind of divine logic in what has occurred, prioritizing the captured sister.
And Muad'Dib stood before them, and he said, "Though we deem the captive dead, yet does she live. For her seed is my seed, and her voice is my voice."
From the main narrative, we can clearly see that the fatal accident shocked Paul, changing his entire being.
"My son is dead," Paul said, and knew as he spoke that it was true. "My son is dead, and Alia is a captive, hostage." He felt emptied, a shell without emotions.
The impact of this death is rooted in the fact that it is the very first accident in Paul's life that did not coincide with the pattern of hero's journey, programmed with archetypes into his unconsciousness. Just as the death of Cain's was cosmogonically illogical, so is the death of Paul's son at the exact moment when the hero completes the stage of apotheosis and atonement with the Father. Paul, according to the logic of myth, should at that very moment have an heir and start to raise him. But his son dies in events over which the omnipotent Paul had not the slightest degree of control. It was just a cosmic accident. That is when Paul realizes the true nihilistic nature of reality. That which so far seemed to be a narrative of his cosmogonical hero's journey is now exposed as a global game of pretense of all the humanity. He is indeed a new messiah of the humankind. He does indeed turn the wheel of cosmogonical cycle and regenerates the world, but such ideas exist only in the heads of people projecting it onto the objective reality, in which nothing makes sense or has consistent patterns.
Deep in the human unconscious is a pervasive need for a logical universe that makes sense. But the real universe is always one step beyond logic.
Paul learns the death of his son from a distorted fragment of a radio message in which was none of the pathos appropriate for an event of such significance. The matter-of-fact way this death occurs, off-screen, speaks volumes. The single most important event of Paul's life lacks the grandeur that such an event should warrant in a monomyth. Another testament as to how pointless the death of his son was is the fact that afterwards Chani gives birth to another child, whom they grant with the same name as the one who died. While Harkonnen has lived through decades of his neurotic years, this child died an infant without affecting anything and having been replaced by another. According to Hero's journey, this death shouldn't have happened, and that's why it hasn't. In the Manual of Muad'Dib there is not a single mention of it. What is also telling is that Paul, the man who maximized his potential as a human being, who has accumulated the greatest cultural capital and conquered the deepest unconscious abyss, becoming the master of both worlds and reaching the enlightened state of Bodhisattva, even he is not invincible against the accidents and pains of the universe.
Paul stared down into her eyes, remembering her suddenly as she had stood once with little Leto in her arms, their child, now dead in this violence.
The pessimistic side of Dune's philosophy is that the system of yin and yang, which entire point is to serve humanity, does not recognize human suffering as a factor. Not just the neurotics and the poor of a disharmonious world, but even those who successfully perform their cosmogonic roles, such as Paul's teachers, are forced to suffer.
Halleck turned away to hide his emotions. Something burned in his eyes. There was pain in him, like a blister, all that was left of some lost yesterday that time had pruned off him.
Hawat reflects on his role in life.
The target dummy beside it patched and padded, looking like an ancient foot soldier maimed and battered in the wars. There stand I, Hawat thought.
It is difficult for Gurney to fulfill his cosmogonic role of a mentor, for he is a person who would just like to relax and live, but the system demands otherwise.
I'm the well-trained fruit tree, he thought, full of well-trained feelings and abilities, and all of them grafted onto me, all bearing for someone else to pick.
He regrets that the wheels of life have to turn so fast.
How soon this child must assume his manhood, Halleck thought. How soon he must read that form within his mind, that contract of brutal caution to enter the necessary fact on the necessary line. Please list your next of kin.
The Reverend Mother sheds tears, performing her role of a supernatural aid, realizing what life has in store for Paul.
But Jessica had caught one glimpse of the Reverend Mother's face as she turned away. There had been tears on the seamed cheeks. The tears were more unnerving than any other word or sign that had passed between them this day.
Alia gets rejected by her peers for her strangeness. Jessica, although she adapts to the life of Arrakis, doesn't stop feeling conscious disgust towards her wormy existence. Paul, upon losing his son, has to feign strength for Chani, telling her reassurances that he himself finds little comfort from.
Holding himself under stiff control, Paul got to his feet. He reached out, touched Chani's cheek, feeling the dampness of her tears.
He cannot be replaced, but there will be other sons.
All of them are unhappy while performing their cosmogonic roles, even though they are initiated. Initiation itself implying a series of trials and losses.
It occurred to Paul then that the making of Halleck's scar had been accompanied by pain. A pain as intense, perhaps, as that inflicted by a Reverend Mother.
In his song, Gurney expresses a desire to avoid trials, even if they carry wisdom with them. Even though he successfully passes those trials, he laments that life is structured as a series of trials and their overcoming, and not as something else. Whatever state of being a person is in at the moment, be it neurosis, poverty, initiation, or the already initiated state of a hero, he experiences some form of pain. The person might hide from this pain in an ivory tower, but only until this tower collapses upon itself. The very cosmogonic cycle implies the necessity of a repeating jihad, the most immoral event of the book, the horror of which is not in its immorality, since morality has shown to be an illusion. What is horrifying is the inevitability of the suffering of all people who exist within the system, despite its very purpose being the continuous empowerment of the human race. Upon this revelation, Paul changes.
There was a melancholy in his tone that she did not like.
He realizes that the system constructed by humanity brings even more suffering and pain than the meaningless universe of coincidence it is projected upon.
And Paul thought, how little the universe knows about the nature of real cruelty.
What is the point then of this system? What is the point in this eternal preservation and empowerment of humanity when life is inevitable suffering? Perceiving the world of cosmic accident, Paul, being the Messiah, tries to at least slightly lessen the suffering generated by the system.
They sense that I must take the throne, he thought, but they cannot know I do it to prevent the jihad.
However, all his attempts were unsuccessful. The cycle has already been set in stone.
He could feel the old man wisdom, the accumulation out of the experiences from countless possible lives. Something seemed to chuckle and rub its hands within him.
Paul becomes just another gear in the system.
Everything he touched brought death and grief, and it was like a disease that could spread across the universe.
You see, it is the system itself is what programs an individual. A person is but a sum of his genetic memory. Paul, Jessica, and Elliot do see the memories of their ancestors after becoming enlightened, and the environment in which he was brought up.
Any enclosed discipline sets its stamp, its pattern upon its students. That pattern is susceptible to analysis and prediction.
An individual is but a product of his environment, and no matter how he tries to oppose it, he is always a part of it.
Paul, she said, there are other awakenings in this universe. I suddenly see how I've used you, and twisted you, and manipulated you to set you on a course of my choosing. A course I had to choose, if that's any excuse, because of my own training.
Every succeeding generation becomes a continuation of the previous, a stepping stone for the evolution of the system along a vector that only it can know. In that is the fatality of human condition. Whoever a person may be, he is limited by his programmed personality. His choice is always the result of his inner computers dealing with data. Calculations which consist of unconscious prejudices, conscious convictions, and other not so apparent factors which form an individual out of human. Jessica, because of her education, has programmed Paul for a certain line of action, and those who programmed her were programmed themselves by other people before them. The flesh the day shapes, and the day the flesh shapes. The system creates people in its shape and image. Paul, who saw the shortcomings of the system, is nevertheless its direct product, and therefore is not able to influence it, just how a human can change the laws of physics that govern the universe of accident. Even the most perfect of human beings, the Buddha of Dune, could not alter the cosmogonic cycle of the system of yin and yang of the human condition. Our God, which cursed humanity with an eternal life of inevitable suffering.